Hello SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded. The videos I'm about to show are just a straight compilation from a video series called Science of the Symbols, where I was looking at the exoteric, as in like to say the real world science embedded in esoteric and occult symbolism, especially in the period of 1500 up to 1800, and this really important period where you get Kircher, Mikkelspacher, Robert Flood, Isaac Newton, even Basil Valentine. He was just a touch before that. But the most of that series is about alchemy, and when I approach alchemy, I'm looking at the practice of chemistry, especially metallurgy, in that period. I do that because that's what interests me, but also I think that's what's not in the discussion. Now, certainly I cannot deny the Jungian aspect, and there are many other interpretations of what alchemy is. Certainly there was a philosophical, spiritual element to it, but just as with the other esoteric occult, even like Freemason emblems, you'll see compass and square and pendulum, it's not pendulum, sorry, plumb lines used for measuring tools. So there are real world tools connected to that. Now, what I've found is that although different periods, for instance, Arab alchemy to, let's just say Western European, just up to and including the Renaissance period, they had, one was Islamic, one was Christian. They had different ideas. You'll see also in China in the East, again, that they had, although there are similarities, there are also many differences between these various philosophical schools. But what they all shared was geometry, arithmetic, architecture, with a quadrivium, but also weights and measures. Now I'm just going to intro that. So in part 33 of the series, I just talk about, I made an effort just to point out that alchemy was, and as chemistry and metallurgy still is now, a very serious business. So mining, for instance, this is De Re Metallica, which is essentially a textbook on mining, which includes heavy lifting but also smelting and these other elements. Now, alchemists were plying their trade, but there was an industrial, scientific, like real-world application and importance for alchemy. So, De Re Metallica, fantastic. It's very rich history, including the translations, but going back to the people who did it, I covered that as well in regards to Hermes, and that the writers attribute famous alchemists, including Hermes Trismegistus in the past, but alchemy, as chemistry is now and what alchemy was, is a deadly serious business. Armies, navies, construction, medicine, banking. The alchemists and their art was at the heart of power, and that is in a real world exoteric sense, not just the esoteric, but these things blend. But just to the import of that, it was well, it was, but it, more importantly, the application of it was in, again, a real world political, military, banking, industrial sense. And that's what I think is very important feature in regards to that. So again, the famed alchemists were applying their trade in an industrial, political, military way. But just to intro that, because this is, part 16 and 20, I'm skipping over. The whole series goes through different elements of this, but in these part 16 to 20, which I'm just going to compile now, the focus is on the astronomy. So whether it's the 7 elements connected to the 7 planets, but also has constellations developed later. Now, for instance, these are in this one part, I'll show the southern hemisphere constellations and how they, including Pavo, but Indus, the Indian, but there are constellations such as, let's go back a moment to clear picture. Okay. Well, we can show, so for instance, horologium, the clock, fornax, which like the alchemist's furnace, Norma and Triangulum Australi, and Circinus, compass and square and straight edge, telescopium. So in this period, especially 1500s onwards, a lot of constellations, which are now not of the 88 official constellations, had very clear connections, like for instance octans, to symbols of navigation, geometry, and alchemy, or the chemist's art as well. So that'll be what I'll be going through, but also the seven, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, etc., but also the connections, how these later constellations, Southern Hemisphere especially, are, just as with so many things, are linked, or they were named after and linked to ancient legends and pagan legends. Interestingly, and this was a very, the Inquisition was still around. The Jesuits and all of that political, religious elements were going on. But again, like Kircher, very heavy Jesuit fellow, just embedding all his works with pagan symbolism as well. And this is just one of the, so that's the feature of it. I just want to, again, to intro that I'm not looking at it from the Terence McKenna aspect. I'm not looking at it from the Jungian aspect. I look at it because firstly it interests me, but also secondly because it's the just not spoken about, really, especially in those circles, that there was a technology, a science application to it that had this veneer of spirituality and psychology and these other things, which can't be denied, of course. Sometimes I'm a little bit strong in my words in response to that type of thing. But again, that's more of a, the pendulum swings back, and it's that in all these alchemical discussions, it tends to be very spiritual, very, and after, like, buzzword salad, I'm sorry to say that, but and again, that may be true, but if it's not based in what the application was, what the great alchemists that are often referred to, what they were actually doing as their business and their trade, and why did they become the great alchemists? Well, what do they share? They were all geometricians, metrologists, and what we would now call chemists, as in metallurgists, dye makers, again working in coins and cannon and navigation, which was so important to the military-industrial complex that rose to become the European powers. And why did Europe become so powerful? Because they were applying alchemy in a real sense, in that, again, they had the industrial scale gunpowder, cannons, navigation, shipping, and more importantly, the bureaucratic organization that comes with that reason and that logic. Because it's, having technology is one thing, but I'd rather have low technology very well organized than have super technology poorly organized, because organization is what gets you to the, what makes you effective. It is not the best technology. Okay, I'm now ranting, but that's an intro into this part. The runtime probably be about 1.5 hours in total. This is part 16 to 20 of the Science of a Symbol series, and again, same sort of themes, but hope you enjoy this.
SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded here, and this will be part 16 in the Science of the Symbols, and we'll be looking at alchemy a little bit more and touching on the Philosopher's Stone. So this is a pretty cool, famous image, and references to phosphorus, and the net might be of interest in here as well. But the Philosopher's Stone is a bit of a controversial one. Again, sort of Hollywood and popular fiction has moved it away from what the alchemists who wrote about it and were talking about it. Now, there is some truth. So the basic story is that it's turning lead into gold, or base metals into gold. Now, I've had some discussions. People say, oh, that's, they've proven that that's impossible. Well, it's not. So what we have is that you can do it. It's at the prohibited, super expensive, and it requires some really advanced equipment, basically a nuclear physicist lab. However, in recent times there has been an even simpler method, but at first it is possible. So it's not scientifically impossible, and it also, there is a possibility. There's no evidence to say that the alchemists of old had a simpler method that didn't require basically a nuclear reactor and all the equipment that goes with it to do it. So, but the possibility remains open, though there is no evidence of it. More than likely, the alchemists who were making gold were making fool's gold of some sort, or fake gold, and again, made a lot of money from that. And that's the important reference to Isaac Newton, and we'll be looking in him briefly. So he's a hero of the materialist sort of modern, science, but it's not looked on well that he was actually an alchemist as well. And he was looking for the Philosopher's Stone. Now this is one of the works of Newton, and again this same reference we saw in Kircher and others, the 7 pointed star, for instance. And we can even say this one, the crescent of the moon, the sun in there, Mercury, Venus, Mars is there, and the sun is there, and we also have Jupiter and Saturn, and each of them is surrounded by the same 7 symbols, which are also the planets. They also represent gods, and they also represent elements. So before the periodic table, this was basically a form of the periodic table. It's also worth noticing feminine and the masculine as well. So sanguina, and also the references to or phlegm. So the 4 humours connect as well, and the 4 elements, earth, fire, wind, and water, is worth referencing. Now that's Newton's. Now historically, so alchemy again is more, in recent years anyway, has been turned into a purely sort of spiritual, mystical thing. Not saying that that's not part of it. It well actually is, if you look into the Hermeticists themselves and the alchemists. However, at the core, at the foundation of it, there are practical aspects, scientific aspects to it. Now, the glass at Chartres Cathedral, for instance, still mystifies now. The light, even on low light, it seems to glow. It's how did they do the optics, and all the light from that comes through this glass is still enigmatic. It's amazing. Another example would be the Iron Pillar of Delhi. Analysis has shown it's got all the impurities that it should rust, but it hasn't. And these are now you also include the marvelous sword makers, metallurgists, or glass makers, dyes, medicines. These were the core aspects of alchemy or chemistry. Alchemy was artificially separated from chemistry. There was just basically a line drawn in the sand with a Royal Society, even though the early days of chemistry was still, in air brackets, pseudo-science. And yet there is a bias, a dogma to, alchemy, pseudoscience bad, chemistry good. Well, if you actually look at the history of chemistry and alchemy, it's an artificial division, and it's also a strong bias against pre-chemist official chemistry. Now, also in Chartres Cathedral, you have this labyrinth. The measures of itself is a lovely set of measures. Even the number of tiles in the labyrinth, beautiful numbers. These harmonic sun, earth, and moon numbers, also a conversion point between ancient units of measure. But the important feature will be the 112 cogs. Now, the labyrinth itself is the same size as a rose wheel. So it's if you were to grip the main wall of Chartres and tip it down, this glass would fall directly on top of this labyrinth. Geber was we get the word gibberish from Geber. Again, it's been a bit perverted, polluted, biased, but Geber, and you see the descriptions of. So the tools they were using, the distillation, coagulation, all these elements is still at the core of chemistry teaching, still to this day. He wrote 112 books, but also this connection to the Emerald Tablet and Hermes Trismegistus as the connections. Hermeticism is another one to these older streams of alchemy. Again, we can just see they were chemists. The 112 now, the Vesica, this famous, the core of sacred geometry, or really Euclidean geometry, but it incorporates the square root of 3, and the best whole number approximation is 265 over 153. If you add them together, you get 418, this repeated number through various schools, but 265 minus 153 is 112. Now that's important because of a reference to the net. So in John 12, he dragged the net, and there were 153 fishes inside. So a reference to the net, and again this number and the vesica itself in cathedrals, the mandala as they call it, is still used in Christian art. Now that's relevant to older, well, for instance, Danae and the baby Perseus were rescued by the Dictys or the net draggers. Another reference to the net, and this is an important reference to Perseus because I'll put some links, but this is a quick example. The story of Perseus, so here we see the northern sky. The story of Perseus is basically, the Clash of the Titans movie, for instance, is a star chart of the northern hemisphere, and also connection to the Greek gods Athena, Zeus, Hermes, and others. And I'll put the link in the description, but these same patterns and imagery can also be found in statues and pediments and all the architecture of cities and all these other things. And so what I'm getting at is that these legends of old actually contain scientific knowledge, important knowledge, and so it's not just a story. There's more depth to it than that. And just like alchemy, it's fiction. Hollywood has sort of turned it into a pure fiction. Well, no, there's actually depth to it. But back to this one, because this is the important point now. So we have references to the net and this 112 and 153. Now, the Greek gods, or the Greco-Roman gods, there's a famous story. Vulcan, who represents fire, as in volcano, or Hephaestus, the god of metalwork, found Venus, which represents copper, in bed with Mars, which represents iron. He cast a silver net on them and secured them to the ceiling. So he put them in a silver net against the sky. Now this will be an important reference to Newton, because Newton was searching for the Philosopher's Stone, and Newton was famous for also having a very small library. He believed that that the Bible and these other ancient works and references were these stories incorporated alchemical recipes and knowledge. And so, for instance, there was Newton's writings were being rediscovered, and say, for instance, the story of Vulcan, he found Venus, copper, and Mars, iron, and then he secured them in a silver net against the sky. So copper plus iron plus fire, and this was a reconstruction of Newton's experiments. And what we have is this substance called the net, which have this fine silver net sort of structure going through it, and very similar to the story of Vulcan, Venus, and Mars. And this aspect of that these older stories contain information, including alchemical recipes, and so will astronomy as well. Now, began with this image of Kershaw was used at the start, and these elements in there, but we have the 7 planets of old, and they also represent all alchemical symbols. And this is a illustration by Dürer, and again we have the same symbols, and we also have the heavens above, the constellations of the zodiac, but also the northern skies being depicted here as well. Now, so Mars, male, god of war, and iron, Ares was another name for him. Venus, also called Aphrodite, the female god. Copper, now hard, male, iron, and soft, beautiful copper. And also Hermes, Mercury, and this very curious mercurial metal. Now we can again back to Newton's drawings, and we see these. It's depicted throughout there. But what's interesting is that what we have is like the 7 elements, 7 stars or points around the central one. So 8 altogether. 7 times 8 is 56. But we also have the feminine and the masculine aspect, so 112, which is a nice connection back to these cogs and these other stories, including Perseus and the net. And okay, now Geber, of course, now back to Mikkelsbacher and this image here, and we have, if we consider that in the same way that we has Newton described and these other alchemists, what we have is depictions of gods, but also depictions of alchemical elements, alchemical processes. For instance, the alchemical wedding of sun and moon, or gold and silver, which is represented throughout all of these drawings, and always Hermes or Mercury having this important position at the top of these, also the zodiac around the outside, and of course alchemical symbols. Now this particular one is important because we have fire, air, earth, and fire, Vulcan or Hephaestus, and also we have these symbols around which represent also the gods: Venus, Aphrodite, Mars or Ares, Sun or Apollo, Moon or Artemis, Diana, Jupiter, Zeus, Saturn, Kronos. And they each represent, again, same thing in this drawing. Now that's a nice comparison, because if you go back to the Newton and that concept of these legends containing alchemical astronomical information, and so we see, Venus and Mars there, which is in this drawing, so Mars and Venus and fire. So we see these different same themes repeated. And so this is another illustration, the Philosopher's Stone and the Serpent of Alchemy, 1622 edition of Philosophia Reformata by J.D. Milius. Now I'm not sure of the exact pronunciation, but alchemy, the sun and the moon, but also, because in this image what we have, again, this reference to the alchemical wedding of sun and moon, just like in these rebus, and well, Mercury there at the top, the primary material, the basic element of transformation, the compass and the square, and also on the dragon or the serpent, just like in the same imagery, just again slightly changed, but again this union of sun and moon. Now Kirsch's drawing, we have again the zodiac, those element symbols, the zodiac drawn on the sun god Apollo, as where the stars are drawn on the moon goddess. But we have the same theme going on, but more than that, Heinrich Kunrath as well. This is his illustration, rebus once more, the Mercury symbol there, the four elements there, ignis, aqua, terra and air, and Azoth, the Mercury, the primary material of transformation, but the union of sun and moon once more. But what really connects is, we zoom in on that one just to make it clearer. Now we come back to this one. We have Pavo, the peacock. We also have the peacock represented on this Kircher drawing, and we also have it here. This is a common standard theme amongst these Hermetic symbols. And back to Jura and the astrologer, and the constellations as well, so the constellations as well as the planets. And pause a moment. Okay, so references to astronomy, to alchemy, to geometry, and again, so Kircher covered the geometry in his works, but also the astronomy and the connections to alchemy as well. So we see the symbols, not only of the constellations there, even we see the constellations of the zodiac, but also the planets and the sun and moon as well. So Jura, Kircher and Kunrath, for example, and Mikkelsbacher we'll get to in a second, but also note once more, I did a video on this, but these symbols, these Hermeticists, in their portraits, for instance, they have these hand signs where they pose with their hands in very unusual positions. They didn't all have arthritis to do this. It's just a constant you see throughout these people. They're dropping little symbols there. But the reference how astronomy and alchemy connect together, especially through the gods, which are all in the elements. So there, again, the northern constellations really were getting depicted there. But the seven liberal arts and then we have the quadrivium, and then we have astronomy. So again, this old depiction of astronomy, well, the constellations around her belt, the sun and the moon, tools of geometry, tools of measurement, the quadrant, the ruler, the compass. It's just repeated all constantly. Now that will connect to Pavo for peacock, as we saw earlier, where we have this peacock illustration, and the constellation Pavo, which again we saw in this Philosopher's Stone imagery. Now if we look, so this is a start, so in the 1500s, Europeans were now in the age of navigation. They were coming into the southern hemisphere, and they were observing constellations they could not see in the northern hemisphere. And including Pavo, and what do we have next to him is Indus, and we see an Indian in the the old-fashioned sense as well. Now that's important because the peacock is essentially an Indian from that part of the world, native, and we see him connected there. Now that's an important reference. So back to the Philosopher's Stone and the Serpent of Alchemy. Well, Hydrus, the constellation, the serpent. And more than that, we also have, so the peacock, Pavo, and we also have this crane image in Grus. Now, what's also next to it is the Constellation Phoenix. So all of these were named, in the 1500s up until the 1800s. So we have 88 official constellations now, and these were added in later, but there's a lot more, and I'll get to those in future episodes. I'm really just, not even touching the sides here. But for instance, we have Triangulum Australi, as it's called, which it will be. I'll get to that again in the future. But we have Ara, the altar, and how does that connect? So back to these Greek god symbols and how they connect to the elements. So Saturn or Kronos, and Jupiter or Zeus, as well as Aphrodite, Mars, god of war Ares, Apollo and Diana, Sun and Moon or Artemis, and Mercury. And how they connect, well, how does that join up? Well, for instance, what do we have in this Mikkelspacher illustration? Again, the alchemical wedding of Sun and Moon, but also the Phoenix. And there we have the constellation Phoenix as well, which you will find, for instance, in Astana, which is the newest of New Jerusalem cities, which is just full of all the symbols and the weights and the measures and the perfect numbers in regards to astronomy. Also connects to, metallurgy as well. But we have this, anyway, the Phoenix symbol, which is this standard. And, next to Pavo, what do we have? Ara, the altar. Zeus and the Greek gods swore an oath on Ara in their war against the Titans, and led by Kronos. Jupiter and Saturn, Zeus and Kronos. So again, we have where the constellations have been described in a way which tell a story, which also pass on alchemical information in there as well. It's a Newton by famous illustrator poet Blake. Now if we go back, so what we'll also see, for instance, Triangulum Australi, it depends on, there's also a plumb line attached, which is next to the constellation Circinus. I'll pause a moment. Okay, so we see this is a earlier version of the southern hemisphere and the constellations connected to it. Now what we have is Indus. However, if you go into your modern star charts, so here we have Pavo, and there you can see Indus upside down, but it's, now Indus has become that American Indian typical headdress in there as well. Now we have Ara, the altar, Triangulum Australis, it's the set square, but it's also, in the earlier descriptions, we also have a plumb line attached to it, so it's a level which connects as well. Circinus, the compass, just out of view, but we have Norma, the right angle triangle, the square to create a right angle. Octans, which is just like a quadrant, that's 1/8 of a circle. It's a sextant, in other words, a early sextant. There is an actual constellation called Sextans, which has a more modern sextant, but what we have is symbols of navigation of weights and measure surrounding there as well. Telescopium, and now, so there's Parvo. You get a sense of octans there, which is this repeated for earlier episodes. I talked about the quadrant, which is in Kircher and Gunther, and how important that is. Okay, for instance, this is Triangulum Australi. What do we have? See the plumb line attached to it. It's which connects to the cornerstones and these ceremonies, the cirque sinus, the compass. And so, yeah, we see Triangulum Australi. Now just to the side would be cirque sinus and the Phoenix and these other alchemical ancient symbols. It's just all bloody there. Now, here's another start. Okay, just off to the side here. So there we have the Phoenix. There we have Parvo. There we have Arrow. Okay, there we get a sense of Norma, the square, the Triangulum Australi, the level, just like in the cornerstones, the compass and square. Where have we seen that? Now, Arrow, or you look at a mason board, you also see the furnace or the altar being depicted on there, or Libra and scales. Now, Hydrus. Now, Fornax, the early name for Fornax was Fornax Chemica, the laboratory of chemicals. It's even, you can even see it's an alchemical reference. Even the name was alchemical. Horologium, a clock with a pendulum. Pendulum, you know, what can you say? It's, you know, these guys, they just wrote it there for us in different ways, and we've just lost it. And now if I open this one, if I can get that open. No, not that one. Okay, that's the one we already saw. Okay, now just expand it a little bit more. And so where are we? So there we have the Phoenix, Horologium, and Parvo there with Octans. So there you see the quadrant, essentially. Again, this instrument which we saw depicted in Kircher and so important to Gunther and to navigation. Norm of a square, but what I want to get is, well, there we see get a hint, the constellation sextans. So the more modern sextant, but also Pyxis, the compass, which is next to Argo, the ship. So navigation, Columba, again, the Columbian symbolism and how important that is, or the Phoenix. And so where we can see these are in the southern hemisphere. I walk out my front door and I can see Crux, or the southern, the South Pole we're looking at, which is, Reticulum, which is another one. So this is a astronomical instrument as well. So there's a famous, that's again an astronomical system to observe the planets as well. And so what we get is that just like the ancient zodiac has back to Babylonian times, incorporates all these really important symbols, and in the form of stories we can carry on, and so the legends and stories, the fairy tales, so to speak, actually are instruments of knowledge and a way to memorize and to learn the stars, which is so important to navigation. We even see the square and these other elements of measure. Hermes, god of weights and measure. Phaeth, god of weights and measure. Hermes was the god of commerce and the god of travelers. Travelers and commercial travelers need to navigate. How do they navigate? By the stars. And so what we have is just a comprehensive, a beautiful system. And little by little, you can see this in the alchemy, the Hermetic drawings and stories and writings. It's all connected in here. And again, this is really just the tip of the iceberg. Especially we'll be examining this more, and the connections are just undeniable. And this is Hermeticism. This is the alchemical origins of it. Now, from these you can then add ritual and mysticism, okay, that's not my thing. But again, so much of the so-called Hermetic alchemical information that's being presented is really devoid of information, to be frank, and that's in my opinion, and I believe I've shown it more than adequately, and we've only gone through it really in a short aspect, going through this very quickly. But whether it's the cornucopia, cornerstones, grain, oil and wine, the Greek legends and the Babylonian stories and the Egyptian information, which just simply all connect. And again, this is a foundation of it. And the alchemists of old and people such as Gunther, Mikkelsbacher, Flood, Isaac Newton, even Da Vinci, all put this information in their drawings, and they were scientists of their time, and this is how they passed on the knowledge. And again, it's just by comparing, just by measuring and examining it, you can see it clearly pops up again. There is something to this. And okay, so again, this is just an introduction into that, because I'll be going more into especially the southern hemisphere constellations and especially how they connect to not only these older alchemical hermetic drawings, but even to Freemasonic and Christian symbols as well. And so with that, hope you enjoy. There really is a lot more to come, and have a good one. Hello, SGD Sacred Geometry Decoded here, and this will be part 17 in the series Science of the Symbols. And so the previous episode I started touching on, well, the Philosopher's Stone, alchemy, and how the symbols of astronomy and the constellations, so the planets, for instance, we see Athanasius Kircher illustration, and we have like Sun, Earth, Moon, Venus, Mercury, Mars, Jupiter and Saturn, how these are also incorporated, for instance, by Albrecht Dürer. Now, of course, all these Hermeticists were into metrology, but geometry especially, and the instruments of surrounding geometry, which connects to, so Hermes, or Thoth, god of weights and measures, traveling and commerce. What do commercial travelers, they need to understand astronomy for navigation purposes, and commerce, people engaged in trade, need weights and measures as well. That's a common theme, but it's how the quadrivium, music, geometry, astronomy and arithmetic all blend together in metrology, in weights and measures, but also in alchemy, because metallurgy is alchemy, amongst glass making, dyes, these very important trade goods of the past. And for instance, we have Mars, god of war, or otherwise known as Ares, the planet, but it's also connected to the element iron. Venus, Aphrodite, the goddess of love and copper. Hermes, or Mercury, the planet, but also the element mercury, which is the prima materia, the prime amalgam, basically. We'll get to that more because it connects to many other aspects. But I mentioned famous alchemists, even though it's not, we shouldn't talk about it, but Isaac Newton, and the alchemy engaged in there, and how his symbols are essentially, he was drawing on the alchemical history, the Hermetic history, and it can be clearly seen in the symbols and the numbers. And but also, for instance, well, he and other alchemists, but he was searching for the Philosopher's Stone, and famously had a small library, but he believed, the old classical history, the Bible, these types of books held alchemical recipes, and a lot of this, the astronomy and the legends and the alchemy, all comes in together. And one example, like recently discovered books, was he believed the first part of the Philosopher's Stone was something called the net, and using the story of Vulcan, or Hephaestus in Greek, the god of fire and metallurgy, found Venus / Aphrodite or copper in bed with Mars / Ares, god of war and iron, and he cast them in a silver net, secured them to the ceiling. And this, again, a very relatively simple recipe where you have copper plus iron through fire constructs the net, and recent reconstructions have backed up what he's saying. Again, the Philosopher's Stone is quite different to what it's usually Harry Potter style depicted as. Now, another famous alchemist, hermeticist of that period was Stefan Mikkelspacher, and the same repeated theme. So we have tincture, coagulation, distillation, putrefaction, solution, sublimation, calcination. These are all standard techniques in still chemistry now, and of course, but they were used by the alchemists as well. Now we also have these 7 figures here: Hermes / Mercury, the prima materia, or Azoth as well in Hermetic alchemical tradition. Alchemical symbols also connected to the constellations of the zodiac, but there are 88 registered official constellations, and the 12 signs of the zodiac are just basically those on the ecliptic, but north and south there are a lot more than that, and these same symbols and emblems and alchemical connections are through there. And we see the same Hermes at the top, Saturn, Mars, and now also we have the 4 basic, which are also connected in old school medicine, the 4 humours, but fire, air, earth and water being repeated symbols throughout these. Now for instance, that's the, if we focus in on this part, there we see that here, and also again how another one of Stefan Mikkelspacher's drawing, including this river, which you might notice that this river emerges where the this Christ figure has his the lance of Longinus, the wound. But anyway, that's for the future. But the gods, the planets, and the elements, and how they connect through there. Now, for instance, Venus, Mars, Sun, Mercury, Moon, Jupiter, and Saturn. These are also the elements, and we see still the basic symbols and elements, emblems. But Venus, Aphrodite in Greek. Ares, Mars was the god of Mars in Roman, but Ares, god of war in Greek. Apollo, the sun god in Greek, and also in Roman, but a lot of the Roman. So, for instance, Hermes was in Greek, but Mercury to the Romans. Artemis was in Greek, but to the Romans was Diana, the moon goddess. Jupiter in Roman, or Zeus in Greek, and Saturn or Kronos. Now this will be an important feature here. So we have the planets, the gods, and the metallurgy of that time and how they come together. Here we see a simplified family tree of the Olympian gods. So Zeus, his sister wife Hera, very reminiscent of Osiris and Isis. Poseidon, god of the sea, or Neptune. Hades / Pluto, Demeter / Ceres, and Hestia, Vesta. But the children here are the children of Zeus, and Hera, sister and husband and wife. But Hera was also the mother of Hercules, Hephaestus / Vulcan, fire, a god of metalwork, and Ares, a god of Mars. Now Hermes was also the god of Zeus, the son of Zeus, Perseus. Apollo and Artemis were the twins, children of Zeus, but by Leto was their mother. And we have Athena, also the child of Zeus, but she sprung forth from his head. And Athena, Minerva, or wisdom, springing forth from the forehead of Zeus. Now Asclepius, usually connected as the son of Apollo, the god of healing, and Aristaeus. We'll get to these as well, because this is all connected, and so basically a crash course in the Greco-Roman gods and their story, because understanding those and then how they connect to the planets and the stars, or the constellations, will also bring forth quite a bit of information into alchemy. And so, for instance, this alchemical chart, Venus and Mars, and so this is just a set, cropped of that one. So we have Mars and Venus and Ignis, or fire, and that brings us back to the alchemy of Newton, how that story of Vulcan, fire, Venus, copper, Mars, and bringing forth the first part of the Philosopher's Stone. Sorry, I should have fixed that, but that's obviously Philosopher's Stone, just a typo there. But how this brings us to the net. So the Philosopher's Stone is much more complicated. There are many steps to it. It's not, again, the sort of Harry Potter Hollywood sort of style that they have to it, at least according to the alchemists of old. Now, our previous episode, the Philosopher's Stone, the Serpent of Alchemy, by Milius. Now that's going into him more because, yeah, anyway, but how in Kersha and Kunraf, these again, how we have this combination, the peacock being a repeated theme, and Azoth or Hermes, the prima materia, Mercury, and again the alchemical marriage of sun and moon, or gold and silver, through Mercury, and we'll come to that as well because that's an important feature into metallurgical history and some interval. But so what we have is in the southern hemisphere, in the 1500s, the age of navigation, they were circumnavigating the world, and now especially they were travelling to the southern hemisphere, and so they started incorporate these different constellations. So the northern hemisphere constellations will come to, but the southern hemisphere constellations, and especially those around Pavo, I'm not sure the exact pronunciation, but the peacock. So here we see early or mid 1500s, and where some of these constellations in the southern hemisphere. And so we have Ara, the altar, the peacock, and Indus, the Indian, the Phoenix, the toucan. Obviously they've travelled to South America, and so the toucan comes into it, and or Triangulum Australi as well. But we'll get to those now. So again, with this image where we have the crane, or even with the long legs, and you can see, she's being one reference very similar to the pelican and this other alchemical image. But the peacock will be the major feature because of the constellation surrounding Pavo and how it connects to Greek gods and Greek legends. So back to Aphrodite or Venus, Mars, Ares, etc., and how they connect through alchemical tradition, but especially the phoenix, and how in the southern hemisphere the phoenix. Now it's interesting. Now the Greeks learned from the Egyptians that the phoenix was a bird that the child would arise from the ashes of the phoenix. It's connected to fire, fire being, of course, a very calcination, very important feature of chemistry, like a Bunsen burner, but also the operation of burning something to ashes to get the salt to purify, and then to even in the simplest form, charcoal burners, and adding charcoal to iron to create steel. But that theme as well with the phoenix. So the Egyptian story that Heliopolian priests of Egypt said that the phoenix was a bird which I think every 500 years was seen coming from the south, which is a nice connection. But now we'll focus on the altar, or Ara, and that constellation right next to the peacock. Zeus and the Greek gods swore an oath on Ara in their war against Kronos and Saturn. Kronos, or Saturn, the leader of the Titans. Zeus was the son of Kronos, Saturn, and he ate his children, all except for Zeus, who was kept safe by Rhea. And the cornucopia story, again, linked in it, because the cornucopia, cornerstones, and these other recent series all connect with this. But so again, we see Jupiter, or Zeus, and the god of the sky, the lightning bolt, and Saturn, Kronos, with the scythe, Father Time, but also with the baby, because Saturn ate his children when they were babies. Then Rhea tricked him by feeding him stones, and he vomited them out, and so the Olympians escaped his stomach and then went to war. But this is all connected here in these southern hemisphere constellations, the peacock and the altar. So here's from Stellarium, but this is the modern artwork connected to these constellations. There's a lot of stuff here, but just as an intro, so that's the picture. But what you need to do is flip it upside down, and then you need to mirror it, because, for instance, a lot of these pictures, when they're drawn, they're shown in a god's eye view, so it's like you're in space looking down through the constellations as they would be transferred onto Earth. So what you need to do is actually like mirror them and flip them around. So you might notice Indus is now spelt backwards, and same because, for instance, Leo the Lion, sometimes you'll see him facing one direction, sometimes the other. That's the difference between the view from Earth above, looking above, or from looking above onto the below. Again, this theme, as above, so below, is repeated throughout the Hermetic tradition. And so we just twist it a bit and then we can get it into place. Now we can see how it overlaps, and I'll just put this over here just to help for the moment. Now we're going to focus on these two constellations, so Pavo and Indus, or the peacock and the Indian. Now you can see this is the original drawing, and that's the original Indus or the Indian there. So what they've just done, so again, just to plot it on, just to get an idea. And what's happened with a lot of constellations is in recent times the artwork has changed from the original. For instance, Delphinus, the dolphin, now looks like a bottlenose dolphin. The older Delphinus is depicted differently, and these are important points to remember. But now, for instance, we see Indus has been changed into a sort of stereotypical North American Indian headdress, where the original Indian was more Amazonian, let's call it, because again, toucan. And the South American Indian, let's call it, as opposed to now it's this North American Indian in this headdress style. Okay, so while we're looking at this Indus and how the original depictions of Indus has changed, it might be worth noting and looking at. So officially now we have 88 constellations, and what's actually happened, sadly, is that we've lost quite a bit of important Hermetic information through that. Now, just a couple examples. So now if you look up the constellation Delphinus, now it is more like, like a bottlenose, like a dolphin. Now that's actually, Delphinus is the dolphin in ancient times, but the original depiction of Delphinus is such, and that's an important feature because it's used in classical architecture, especially in a more stylized swirl form. That's just one example. Now, another example, so for instance, if we look at this older astronomical depiction, now just to give an idea where that is, so we have the ship Argus, and so there we have the ship, and there we have the tip of this tail of Hydra, the constellation, and we just get a bit of a hint of Corvus, the bird there. So just the ship, the snake, and Corvus, the blackbird. So there we see the snake, Hydra, and Corvus. Now, and the ship, so just give an idea. Now, this constellation, Noctua, is no longer an official constellation. And we also have sextans, as in sextant. But Crater, this constellation here, now this will all connect the snake, Crater, and the blackbird. Corvus all connects again to another Greek legend. For instance, Apollo, Corvus was his servant bird. He sent Corvus to get him a cup of water, Crater. Corvus messed around, didn't come back in time, and then when he did come back with a cup of water, he blamed his lateness on the water snake. Apollo realized he was lying, and as a punishment he cast Corvus, Crater, and the snake into the sky as a reminder, don't lie to the gods. Now we get to Noctua, the owl, and so for instance, now if we compare this, so this, we see the modern version, and we have Virgo. Now Noctua should be at the tip of his snake, is no longer there. It's no longer one of the official constellations, and it's interesting that the grain of Virgo, which connects to Isis as well, the owl wisdom as well. So Bubo, the owl of wisdom, connected to Athena, for instance, would sit directly between the scales of Libra and the grains, and grains being a reference to the old system of weights and measures. These are just some examples of the constellation art has its changed and lost constellations, and actually we've lost a bit of information in there, but let's move along. And so now we focus on Pavo and Ara, or the altar. and so just that's again the original ones. You might also notice so Octans, Norma, Circinus, Telescopium. So the older pictures of Pavo, the tail is changed to make room for Telescopium. So we've had some constellations added from the early 1500s up until the 1800s or late 1700s, but you can see how they're not shown here in this older illustration, but they've been added later. And we'll get to the meaning and connections of those, but now we'll just be focusing on the peacock and the altar, or Ara and Pavo. Now this has got a lot to do again with Greek gods and Greco-Roman gods, which were just like the zodiac and the constellations actually do go back further than that, but just because it's so well recorded, I'll use these as a reference. So the Titans, prior to the Olympian gods, the Titans were in charge, and the chief of the Titans was Saturn or Kronos. Now Saturn, again, you'll often see him with the babe connected to him because he ate his children, all of them except for Zeus, who was hidden away, which connects to Capra and the Aegis, and well, that's, I'll put a couple other links in the descriptions, the cornucopia being one reference as well. So Saturn, as in the planet, one of those 7 represented in the traditional alchemical drawings, that would be lead. And we have Jupiter, the Roman name for Zeus, and Jupiter represents tin. But Zeus was the head of the Olympians, the 12 Olympians, and Saturn was the head of the Titans. Interesting to note, since like the moon, astronomers even like in the 1600s started, they could, when the telescope became available, they started even mapping. They saw the moons of Saturn and Jupiter. Now Titan, as in the Titans, that's the largest moon of Saturn. And of the many moons, for instance, of Jupiter, Io, and Europa, and these will be important because they also connect to the Greek gods. But what happened was that the Titans, the Olympians, Saturn was tricked into vomiting up the children that he had swallowed. Zeus was not swallowed, but he led the Titans in a revolt against. Zeus led the Olympians in a revolt against the Titans, and that was his famous war of the Titans and the Olympians. And it's sort of appropriate for the moment because this Affinity Wars and Thanos, this Marvel, like Marvel and these and Harry Potter and all this other stuff, they draw upon this. Thanos, this destructive god, was born on Titan, but leave that to the side. Let's stay with the classical. And so the Titans, the Olympians went to war against the Titans and defeated them. And that's why the Olympian gods took hold. Now there's connections there because the Olympians swore an oath of loyalty on the altar of Ara. So that's one of the reasons why this constellation was depicted as such. Ara the altar. And this will now link the Olympians. Now Zeus was the head of the Olympians, and his sister wife was Hera, also known as Juno. Very similar to Isis and Osiris, his sister-wife relationship, which is a common theme across cultures. Now Io and Europa are important in this part because, well, first, Hera, also known as Juno, that's where we get June from, that's one of the names, and Hera rode a chariot driven by peacocks. Pavo, the peacock constellation. This will be an important reference. It's also worth noting the Caduceus here. Now, also Io was said to be a chief. Now, with this Greco-Roman legends, can be slightly different variations. So I'm sticking with one. You can look into it more. But Io was also the priestess, the high priestess of the Hera/Juno cult. But what happened was that Jupiter or Zeus fell in love with Io, and to protect her from Hera's wrath, Zeus turned her into a beautiful white heifer. Hera was, she's the goddess of coupling and of children and of marriage, and she's also a bit of a mama bear. You don't mess around with Hera. She doesn't take crap, put it that way. But again, we can see this depiction again with the peacocks and Hera, and that connection there as well. Again, the peacock here. Now, Cancer. So, and now over time this will change, but in at least the last few thousand years, the month of June and Cancer connects there because it's a zodiac reference as well. This will be an important repeated feature throughout. Now, to protect Io from his the wrath of Hera, Zeus turned into a beautiful white heifer, and then, well, Hera, she wasn't taking that lightly, and so she had Argus, this fellow here, had the heifer tied to an olive tree. Now, the caduceus of Hermes, the wand, translates to a measuring rod. That's the original Greek version of it. You can see even Hermes with the traveller's cap and the wings on his. Now, Argus was charged with looking after, or keeping her in Io, the white heifer, in captivity, tied to an olive tree. Then Hermes, the son of Zeus, also known as Mercury, rescued Io by lulling Argus into sleep with music. Now the thing is, like this picture doesn't quite show it, but Argus had 100 eyes, and when he slept, only 2 eyes were ever closed when he slept. But Hermes, or Mercury, was able to, using music, and he's a god of knowledge, trickster god, he lulled him into sleep, and he was able to rescue Argus, because Io, because of it. Now, for instance, if we go back to the original Greek pottery, here we see Hermes with the traveller's cap, and we can see Argus with the 100 eyes on there. So it's a better description of it. Put him to sleep, all the eyes closed, and then he was able to overcome him and chop off his head. Now, it's also worth looking at this piece of Greek pottery, because here we see Hermes and Argus, and there we see Io, the white heifer. Now, I only bring this one in because the Greek pottery of this time, they didn't use colours it was this two-tone method, and I bring that up because especially in recent years, there's been this whole stuff going on that this somehow proves, because he's wearing, everything's black. It's got nothing, sorry Tariq Nasheed, you're full of crap. It's just really pitiful that this sort of stuff is brought up, because it's just silly. Because again, as a evolution, different forms of Greek pottery, that's got nothing to do with it. So I just bring that up because it is an important thing. But yeah, so Hermes put Argus to sleep, all his 100 eyes closed. Now, if you look at this older picture, who do we see? We see Hera with the peacocks, and we see Hermes, a traveller's cap and the wings. He's just cut the head of Argus. Now, you don't see the 100 eyes on there, but it's important to, and all the cattle in the background. So that's Hermes decapitated Argus. Now, Argus had 100 eyes, then he died, but then Hera and her peacocks. So that's why do the peacocks have all these eyes on them? Because the eyes of Argus were put onto the peacock feathers. So that's now it's also important to note, because again it just shows that the ancient Greeks were communicating with the ancient Indians. There was trade had been established for a long time before, but still there's some people who just can't accept the fact that the Greeks and the Indians and the Greeks and other people, that there was actually a wide-scale trade going on at the time. So now we see how the Greek gods, especially Zeus, Hera, connect to these constellations, Pavo and Ara. And it's also worth noting, so Jupiter Zeus fell in love with Io and turned her into a white heifer, a white cow. The moon named Io, and Europa is also connected because Zeus, or Jupiter, also had an affair with Europa, and he appeared to her as a white bull. So there we see again in this older ancient art as well, the white bull. So we have again Io and Europa, so how the names of these things connect. I'll put the link in the description, because even in pediments, so these triangular gables which are used in ancient buildings, and now they're actually passing on the same Hermetic information. It's astronomical, it's mythology, it's also alchemical references, and again I'll put that link in the description, because how it all brings this up, and this is why this Greco-Roman classical history is important to understand and decode these emblems. Okay, now as an example, because I'll go into more into this aspect, because this has been Southern Hemisphere. There's a lot more to come still yet in regards to, especially the constellations and the zodiac and the 7 planets or 7 heavenly bodies. Now, Cass Gilbert, very important American architect, Freemason. For US Supreme Court, I did a building study of this building, the measures, the symbols throughout, all Hermetic, 100% Hermetic, just like the White House and US Congress, US Capitol building. He also did the Woolworth building, famous early skyscraper in New York. Again, I covered this in a series I did on Hermetic New York. 792 feet, just like 66 feet is 792 inches. Joins New Jerusalem, Ark of Utnapishtim, all these older ancient legends as well through verifiable weights and measures. It's also interesting that Alchemy Properties took over in recent years the Woolworth building, but this will put that down to coincidence. And in the next one, we'll start looking at, because Cass Gilbert also did the West Virginia Capitol building, and these emblems and symbols here are full of Hermetic ancient influence. We also see above the entrances the Greco-Roman gods, Vesta, Hestia, Neptune, Ceres, Hercules, Jupiter, Fortuna, Mercury, Vulcan, Athena, Perseus, Prometheus, and Hera and Juno. And they will be for the next videos, because again, constellations, myth, alchemy, or chemistry, Hermetic weights and measure systems, it all just blends in together. And so with that, I hope you enjoyed this one. And again, we'll be carrying on in the next few episodes, and have a good one. Hello, SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded. This will be Science of the Symbols Part 18. And previous episode I went into the Southern Hemisphere constellations. These were at least officially named between the 15 to the 1800s, and all the drawing connections. But so there we see Stellarium screenshot. And so what's happened is, as I showed in previous episodes, we've lost a few constellations. Some have been redesigned. So for instance, Indus is now more of your American Indian. If we see the original Indus, it was more of your Amazon type, I would suppose you'd call it. But okay, now the connections. Previous episode I went into, let's go back, so we had Pavo and the Indus and Indus constellation. Best to look at this one. And Pavo and Ara here. So we had these two. Previous episode went into the Greek gods, these legends, and how they incorporate information, stories, and especially, well, you can use them for many aspects, alchemy, but also has a star chart, astronomy, geometry, arithmetic, and music, and alchemy, and weights and measures come in that and bring these things all together. And Hermes to the Greeks, Mercury to the Romans, the god of a trickster, but he was a god of knowledge, but he was also a god of commerce, weights and measures, and travelers. What do commercial travelers need? Weights and measures to sell their goods, but also they need navigation. And he was also the god of knowledge, so very similar into as with Thoth in Egypt. This knowledge of weights and measures for angles, geometry, these aspects are essential in building the building trade. So whether it was the cathedrals, the great temples of Greco-Roman times, or the pyramids, the same gods, the same aspects have, they're the scientists, let's just call them. And of course, to that is connected alchemy and metallurgy, and to build the tools, the chisels, all the different things that connected. And these will also all be told here. And again, this is one portion of the Southern Hemisphere constellation. So this shot, I think the location was basically on the South Pole, looking down. Now, for instance, Crux, the cross, that's the Southern Cross, as we call it. Here in Australia, we can't see the North Star. We have the Southern Cross. It's on our flag. That's our North Star down here in the Southern Hemisphere. And so that's from this position. That's why it's pretty much in the dead center, because this would be, now obviously Antarctica doesn't look like this. This is just a generic background that Stellarium uses. But we got Ara and Pavo, the Greek gods in these stories. Now in this one we'll be looking at especially Freemasonic symbols. Now Freemasons, all their symbols are symbols of the old craft, of the temple builders, the cathedral builders, the dividers, hammers, chisels, and as you can see, this it's partially obscured, this triangle with the level. That's a level there, and these different tools for cutting. Now, for instance, these type, okay, I won't get into that, but now a Freemason board, we have the compass, we have a level there, have another level there, it's to find the horizontal level. This instrument is to find the vertical level. We have the square, we have multiple compasses, a ruler, chisels, the ashlar, the mallet, these, the hammer. These are all symbols, legacy of the older craft guilds, of the people who built the temples, the cathedrals, the major public buildings. They're into their geometry and their science. That was an essential part of the trade. Now, in the modern sense, it's all been put into ritual and symbol, but there are strong, dedicated to engineering and the sciences. These are all connected. Now I'll be using mainly this board to explain this, but because there's slight variations, but we have basically the same elements. Now, I've also been mentioning the work of Kircher frequently. This is one of his drawings. We'll be drawing on this a lot as well. And also worth mentioning, so previous episodes I talked about, so the papal symbol of the triple crown and the silver and the gold key, the alchemical wedding, the triple crown of a hierophant, which goes back to the ancient Eleusinian mysteries and these strong connections to Mithras and these other cults. Well, this particular Mason board, we also have the triple crown and the keys most often associated with the Pope, but it's not a papal symbol because the Pope and these other people have drawn on ancient mysteries, the ancient systems of knowledge, and those who kept the secrets, so to speak. Now, so we'll just begin. So Libra, one of the constellations of the zodiac. So, for instance, in your astronomy in the newspaper, that's Libra. There we see an older piece of art, and we can find that in the tracing board there as well. So what you find is the symbols of the craft, of the old science and engineering in there. Libra. Now, next to Libra we have Norma. That is from the Latin word normal, which means a right angle. But it's this was one of the constellations named in the late 1700s by a French astronomer. I can't recall his name, but especially between the 1500s to the 18th, so 15 of the 1700s, you had the age of exploration, and whereas especially the European were exploring the south, taking observations of the south, like Captain Cook's epic journey, he come to observe a transit of Venus. But Norma, or the right angle, or the carpenter's square, and so this is like a modern example. You got the level as well, so also this particular modern tool, but we have a right angle, 45 degrees, but a ruler as well. Because I've mirrored the image, the letters are backwards, but that's what Norma is, the carpenter's square. But if we look at the older depictions of it, it's a square and a ruler. Weights and measures, objects of the craft. And so where do we have a square? So we have a square here, and we have a square. And if you just Photoshop those onto the top. Now we also have the ruler, the measure tool, the measuring rod, the wand. Wand is an old Greek word for measuring rod, or the reed, which is again so important in the biblical traditions, and basically the Indian temples, all these other temples, you can't live without it. It's an essential tool in civilization. Standard weights and measures, still in this modern day, but also in the ancient economies. Also on this Kircher drawing, which we have the compass degrees and all these other tools, but we also have a ruler. You can say 15. And again, this is so an important tool. So throughout this Kircher board, for instance, we have a pointing to the cross staff, the quadrants, and the plumb lines, but we'll come to this, but even how the strings are a little bit serpentine. But Norma, the older ones, the square and the ruler, we have in the boards the square and the ruler, weights and measures. Now, just above Norma, we have Circinus, I'm not sure, Circinus, but what is that? Where we draw on the older art, and it's a set of dividers. so important in, for instance, you see the old sea captains on their map, and still now using the dividers to measure out distance. But it also works as a compass, because all you got to do is have a pencil lead or a ink on there, and a set of dividers also becomes a compass. And of course the compass or dividers is also repeated throughout any standard Freemasonic overcraft tracing board. And so just as an example, and Norma, Circinus, and now we have Triangulum Australi. Again, this modern constellation art, we've lost the original meanings of it, but if we view it there, what we see is it's not like a triangle standard one. We have, what it is actually a level, and you can even see that because of serpentine, the plumb line, so that would hang down and create a level, which is important. So this is again since the beginning of time to find your levels, and using this tool. And it also applies to the gromma, which was also used in ancient Egypt as well as a tool of survey and of temple building to find your levels. And you get if you know how to use these very simple tools, you get high levels of accuracy. But you'll also find it, so for instance in cornerstone ceremonies, Freemasons often preside. We see the square, which we mentioned earlier from Norma. We also see them using this instrument, the level, to find the level of the stone, which is the various depictions, but that's your level there, the plumb line and the horizon. And you can just Photoshop Triangulum Australi on the top, and if that string was left to hang freely, it would create a level. In this I showed earlier, but this is an old set of tools. Again, you can see it there, it's a little bit obscured, but that's what we have. And also worth mentioning, because we have these these plumb lines. Now the quadrant is a way of, like a primitive sextant or an octans. It's a way of measuring degrees, not just for astronomical observations, but also, for instance, with some basic trigonometry, you can work out the height of a tower. If you know how far you are away, and you can view the angle to the top, bang, you know your height. You can also use it for all these sorts of other applications of survey, temple building, but also applies to astronomy as well. And now we have octans, and it's still pretty much true to the original version, but this is also an ancient tool of survey. This one was resting on a table, but this pendulum would sit down the middle, and as you tilt it, now it would give you an angle. You can even see it's got the reticulum. So again, like a very simplistic, like a more simple sextant to measure angles, so the sun or the planets, but also again, you can measure the height of mountains, and with a little bit of, as long as you have an angle and a distance, you can work out using some trig and work out all the rest of it. And even this drawing has these, it's trigonometry there, it's just written in an illustrative form. These are two, so this is a quadrant. Now Edmund Gunter, who formalised the chain and the mile that we know now in English law under Queen Elizabeth I, this is Gunter's quadrant. You can even see the lines there on this Kircher drawing, how it has the same basic thing going on, but it's really just one half of a protractor to measure the degrees, and then a plumb line to find the angle. And this is also Gunter's drawing, the cross staff. So what do we have here? A cross staff. And we also have octans there as well, and you can see that dot there, it's the plumb line angle as well. So there's but tools of survey, tools of engineering, tools of measurement. And so how octans applies, and again we see that's, you can just, if I was just to cut out the rest, you probably wouldn't even notice that I had inserted this quadrant into this Kircher drawing. Over here we have Calum. Now that the image is bent in the modern depictions, but that originally was sets of chisels. Now it's called the inscribers. So when you do what's the term? When you like you cut a name into what's inscription, not inscription. When they, anyway, you probably get the idea. But the old again is a set of chisels Chisels, of course, being essential to the craft and to engineering. And so, for instance, mason boards, you have the chisel and these other tools of the trade of construction in there as well. Now, up above here, okay, I'll pause for a moment and just to separate this into parts. We're approaching the 15-minute mark rather than stick them together. Okay, but we have Columba, and what do we have over here? Columba, the dove with the olive branch. Columba with the olive branch. This is the old art form as well. Columba again with the olive. That's so the UN flag has the 13 olives. You have this 13 olive in all across American church symbolism as well. It's a connection to Columba the dove and to Noah's Ark, and this is another standard feature in mason boards. Noah's Ark, he released the raven and the dove. It's a symbol of hope, but it also connects to Noah's Ark. And Ark of Utnapishtim from Epic of Gilgamesh tells essentially the same flood story. He released a dove, a raven, and a swallow. That's about the only difference in there, and all the weights and measures too. Basically get any Freemason board, you'll see the Ark, and even here on this Templar board or the Temperance Society, the Ark and the dove. It's not exclusive to Freemasons, Oddfellows, all these older craft guilds, esoteric groups have it in there. I mentioned earlier Ara Ara. And hello, SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded, Science of the Symbols, Part 19. Previous episode, we're looking at these constellations, especially in the Southern Hemisphere, and how they connect, firstly, to Hermetic works, Freemasonic tracing boards and symbols, rituals, and Kircher, this Jesuit, and the craft, so cathedral, temple building, all the way back to, well, the beginnings of construction and how important they are related to the gods Hermes or Mercury. Hermes, Hermeticism, God of weights and measures, knowledge, etc., just like Thoth, and how this has been passed on. So part 19, and now we do a focus on, so also Greek gods and old legends, so the altar of Ara and Pavo to the Titans and the Olympian gods. And now we'll have a look at the constellation Columba, which is next to what was once known as the ship Argo Navis. Now these have been broken up into pieces under the modern 88 constellations, but the dove with the olive branch, even again the modern constellation art has really messed up the origins of it, because we go back to, for instance, this Kircher illustration, and we always find the 13 leaves. So again, the UN building, UN flag has 33 sections, but 13 leaves around the outside. The eagle on the American dollar has in the hand of peace has 13 leaves on the olive branch. On the hand of war, it has 13 arrows. But this is a important symbol. So throughout the Hermetic tradition, but back old ancient legends, the flood story especially, not just Noah's flood, but the Epic of Gilgamesh description as well. But now that's, so there we see the original, and what do we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 leaves. That's a very important feature that's lost in this modern depiction. So there we see the importance of Columba, and again we've gone through this images and others, so many connected aspects. But if you look at this mason board, and by all of them really, what we have is the Ark, Noah's Ark there as well, even little pigeonholes as well. And it's hard to tell, but this, again, we have the dove, Columba, with the branches, and so that connection is a very strong one. And for instance, Noah released a raven and he released a dove in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim. Just like the same thing, he created an ark to survive the flood. They call it preserver of life. He released a raven, the blackbird or white bird, and the swallow. The raven sat on the rotting meat that was floating. It was, it's like an unclean bird. The dove wouldn't sit on those things, so the dove kept coming back until he found a twig, that the trees had re-emerged after the flood. And the swallow is very similar, because swallows don't settle down on the ground, or they don't like to. They like to stay in a high position. They'll usually, so very much like the swallow won't sit on the rotting, floating meat, and neither will the dove, the pigeon. And that's another aspect. Now, again, you can just standard feature the mason board with Noah's Ark there, this symbol of hope and restoration. This is again a Templars board, which has all the other symbols running throughout. It's just a constant, and even the roses. But what we have is the dove, Columba, and the Ark. Now, DC, District of Columbia, but there are 4 really important cities: Astana, Washington, Brasilia, and Canberra here in Australia. They're designed on the same geometric pattern of Washington. Sacred geometry and symbolism in Washington. Even the hardcore skeptics, don't really fight that one anymore. But Brasilia, Washington, and Astana, which emerged later, especially Astana, it's a very modern city. They have the same symbols, the geometry, the measures in their buildings, the same elements. This is carried on throughout time, as they say, in plain sight. Still in this secular, modernist computer world, they're spending trillions to build these cities, temples, and etc. It's still carrying on. It's measurable, it's testable, it's observable. You just got to accept the facts of it. But okay, previous episode, I talked about the altar that the Olympian gods swore their loyalty on, and also Parva, how it connects to Hera or Juno, the goddess, sister wife of Zeus, and all the other things. But now the altar is also a feature. So again, Ara, we see the depiction, and we have this also as a standard feature on mason boards as well, which also has connections to alchemy. Now also horologium, again this modern one, it's a timepiece. Now a pendulum clock. Now we have quartz crystals. A 1 meter pendulum swings once per second, and full of measure and beautiful information there. But for instance, the Tower of the Winds in ancient Greece, in Athens, was a timekeeping temple. It had water clocks, it had sundials, and all these other methods. It was a weather station as well, and it was a horologion. So it was that's where the term comes from. And again, they're measuring time. So measuring rulers, measuring angles, measuring these other aspects. It's another connection to the ancient craft and the ancient sciences, which would also connect to alchemy, because using a pendulum is the simplest way, or an hourglass, because the hourglass is another standard feature on the boards. It symbolizes mortality, but it's also a timekeeping piece. Now, when you're engaged in metallurgy or alchemy, chemistry, keeping time is an important feature, because for how long do you mix? Getting the right amount of time is an important feature. So this does have a strong connection to that as well. But you can also apply it to music, or in astronomy, you want to measure the movement of objects. So it's just it can't be really separated, and it's clearly depicted in the ancient temples and the ancient art forms. Again, the hourglass being the more common feature. Now we bring up Musca, the fly. Now this is an important one. I did a series a while back on Hermetic New York, and amongst the buildings I was talking about was Grand Central Terminal. Well, again, recent series on the cornucopia consistently talk about Hermes, the winged cap, traveller's cap, carrying the caduceus, the wand, or the measuring rod, the reed, which is the origin of that word. Also notice, for instance, the anchor here, because if we go back to, again, any tracing board, now where is it? I know it's the anchor. So that's again is another faith, hope, and charity. The dove is hope, the heart is faith, and again I did a series on faith, faith, hope, and charity as well. But that's, for instance, in here. So again, this is entirely Hermetic. Just this piece of Grand Central Terminal. Here we get another more recent picture, but again the cornucopia. It's hard to be from that angle. You don't get all the aspects. Now, again, the globe, but caduceus, the measuring wand of Hermes, god of weights and measures, knowledge, travellers, commerce, and the timepiece as well, which is a nice reference. But this is the main terminal building at 120 feet or 1440 inches. This is a really important number biblically and also in the yugas and all. Again, this is just a beautiful number. It's just repeated again. But for instance, 120 feet wide or 275 feet long, that's 3,300 inches. 120 by 275 feet is 33,000 square feet. This is a esoteric, Masonic, Hermetic, alchemical building, and I did a whole series on just New York, but you can find it in Washington, on all the major cities, but that's just one example. Now, earlier I mentioned how to get this old illustration to fit the stellarium chart. So on stellarium, you're on the Earth looking up. Now, these old astronomers would usually would draw the pictures in the God's eye view from, so you're deep in space looking down on the Earth, and that's why these words are all backwards. You have to flip it around to get it to fit. Now, in a globe with all the constellations, that's a God's eye view, so that's what's happening. So these would be, so Leo looks in this direction, for instance, Leo the lion, but you'll see in other artworks, he'll be looking in the other direction. If you're to look at stellarium and look up Leo, he'll be looking in the other way, because this is a constellation globe. Again, it's you have to imagine like the God's eye view, as above, so below, as below, so above. It's Hermeticism, it's Hermetic. This is the Grand Central Terminal constellations drawn in the ceiling. Now, it's said that they were done backwards by a mistake, and you'll so often see it. So again, pediments. I'll give you all sorts. The official literature will give you all sorts of rubbish when they talk about it, because you'll see it's the Greek gods, and so when you see the cattle, which is a standard feature in the pediment, they'll say it's high because in Australia the cattle industry was so important. But they have Apollo and Athena and all the other things in there. But, well, just like Grand Central Terminal, the ceiling, that it was done backwards. No, it's the God's eye view again, just like in what you would find in this celestial globe. It's absolutely shocking, really, how often the standard literature descriptions, which people just accept because it's official, it's just rubbish. It really is. But the important feature here is Musca. Now, the Fly constellation, or Musca, is next to Aries, or it was. It's no longer an official constellation. It's been incorporated, like amongst the 88 official constellations. It's been moved now. Again, as we see, so Musca and Aries are Fly. Now that's on the ecliptic, so that's around the equator, essentially right next to it. But if you look at stellarium now, Musca, the Fly, which has been renamed from an older form, is right next to Crux. That's the south. That's the South Star. The cross that's the equivalent of the North Star. It's the South Cross, Southern Cross. Musca is now there because it was renamed. It was originally called Apis, the bee, as in apiarist, the beekeeper. Beehives, bees. Now this is Goulburn, again a very Masonic city. We have the beehive and the bees. This is a very important feature because Freemasonic lodges were commonly known as hives back in the day when a lodge would split. So you might have a larger town, and then a smaller town was large enough to have its own lodge. When they split, was called swarming. You can pause and read this because it's also a symbol of industriousness and these other aspects as well. But it's a standard feature on tracing boards. It also connects to the Greek god Aristaeus, son of Apollo, who was the patron god of cheese making, beehives, and these things. Basically, the long preserving food. Ceres was the fresh food goddess. Aristaeus was the god connected with, imagine like salami or cheese and these things that you can preserve for a long time. Oddfellows again, the dove, same thing, 13 leaves, and just a standard symbol. Okay, it's all in all the important buildings where you'll have the anchor as well, but these other symbols, but also you'll have the beehive in there too. Now, okay, so there we had Musca, Phoenix. It's a part of legend, but also the Hermeticism. It's a tool. It's a description used in the Alchemists. They described it before. So there we see this chart, Constellation Phoenix. And next to it we have Fornax. And why is that important? Because originally it was called Apparatus Chemicus. That's not the original name was Fornax Chemica. That's an earlier description of it. Basically the chemist's laboratory, the alchemist's laboratory, because chemistry was still not officially chemistry, but again we see these features. It's an alchemical description as well, and how this connects to masonry, because for instance on a standard mason board you have the ashlar and the stone the builders rejected. I should have just enough time to sneak that in. Anyway, the stone the builders rejected is connected to alchemy as well, but I'm hitting the 15-minute limit. I might just be able to sneak it in. But we have the square stone and the untested stone. Okay, there it is. Really running short. I have to sneak this in quickly, but on the mason board you see a stone which is square and a stone which is uncut. That's alchemy. Hello, SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded, and this will be Science of the Symbols, part 20 in the series. And we'll be carrying through with the same theme. So it's been a bit of a mix of alchemy and astronomy, but Hermetic wisdom, Hermes. And so here we see an old star chart of the Northern Hemisphere. So what we have there is the pole star in the middle. Around the outside we have the zodiac symbols, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Aquarius, etc. But how does this connect? Well, we'll get more into it, but alchemy and the Hermetic school of knowledge, Hermes, god of weights and measures, god of knowledge and commerce. Commercial travelers need to navigate knowledge, all astronomy, commerce, weights and measures, measuring the stars. This all comes in together. And you see when you look closely at the symbols, especially, well, it just all, it's quite a bit there. For instance, so this was, it's the old ancient Greek depiction. We'll have a look at the more of a modern Roman Mercury depiction. But here we see Siena Cathedral in Italy, and you can even see Hermes, Mercurius, Trismegistus. So Hermes, Trismegistus, Hermeticism, Hermes, the people involved in drawing these star charts, the alchemists of the time, the mathematicians. One thing that unites all of these people of this era with earlier quadrivium knowledge is geometry, astronomy, music and arithmetic. This is undoubtedly the foundation stones that which joins them. You don't need hallucinogenics. Okay, so now the theme of astronomy, and especially of navigation, how this connects to Hermetic wisdom. Sun and the moon and the zodiac around the outside. The compasses, references geometry. What she also has is a quadrant, just like described by Gunther. Again, cirque sinus, dividers, the compass, and the octans. Now, I'll put the link back to episode 17 because we're looking at the southern hemisphere stars, and there we saw, and for instance, Pavo, the peacock, Octans, well, Ara, and Pavo, and how this was connected to the Titans and the Olympians, the Greek gods, and these legends describing a system of knowledge, not just a nice story, but it actually all connects. It begins with a story, but then it evolves into the measurable, the important things of a civilization, navigation, weights and measures, and of course alchemy or metallurgy, and these it just all blends in with these ancient stories. But for instance, in episode 17, the dividers and that constellation Cirque Sinus, we can see that in this depiction of astronomy in regards to the quadrivium. We also have a compass, the constellation Pyxis, which is just next to the ship, which is next to Columba and all these other important instruments, where we have a mix of more modern constellations, but also ancient stories and ancient constellations, such as the 12 signs of the zodiac and others, and also Octans, this instrument of navigation, which, again, you look at your classical navigation tools, pre-GPS. We also have Pyxis, the cross staff, and Octans. Telescopium's also one of those constellations that's been added, telescopium. Now we go further. Okay, so now we're looking at the modern constellation view using stellarium. And what do we have? Have the North Star there. And what we have is a star, the constellation that are very recognizable to all people, and that's Orion. So we begin with the North Star. The North Star, what's more important to navigation, especially for the Greco-Roman era, is the North Star. Down here in Australia, we can't see it. We work by crux or the Southern Cross. It's even on our flag, but essential to navigation. Now it's interesting that Great Pyramid shafts, which track the movement of the North Star through precession, and also how it points to Orion's belt as well, and Sirius, but which is another important. The Orion's belt points at Sirius, but Orion. Now Orion's belt, those three stars, which most people can, it's very clear in the night sky. That's again, even, in very bright stars, just like Sirius, Orion's belt. Even with light pollution, you can still see these, and essential to pre-electronic satellite navigation. Also worth noting the Pleiades, they're in Taurus, so just above. So this is how you can also track this. Now what we have is a story, these ancient stories are actually describing a star map, so essential in navigation. And so we have a blending of legend and scientific knowledge, which is so important in the Hermetic tradition, and navigation, commerce. Now we're looking focus on Perseus, this constellation here, which is been immortalized in recent times by a couple of, so back in the 80s, Clash of the Titans movie, and recently they did another version. And the original Clash of the Titans movie, they twisted the story a little bit. The more recent one, they really screwed it up. So this is the 1981 version, is the one worth watching if you haven't seen it. This more recent one, just completely ignore it. Lots of good CGI, but that's a problem with Hollywood. They just ruin things. Now, so in the original with Harry Hamlin, we see holding the Medusa's head, the snake, turn people to stone if you look upon her. Classical art descriptions, we see Perseus with this sword and the helmet. We'll get to this, but again, holding the decapitated head of Medusa. And we look at your more classical imagery, Perseus and Athena, and there she's holding the head. Now, the blood of Athena, the blood of Medusa, one half was deadly, one half was giving immortality to mortals. Athena gave half the blood to Asclepius. That's why we have a rod of Asclepius. Unlike the Hermetic Caduceus with two snakes, Asclepius, god of healing, is the one snake around the rod. But this is also connected. Now this is Rochester, New York. Hermes with the two snakes, the winged helmet, wings on his feet. These have probably been knocked off, but the winged feet. And he's standing on the head of Medusa. This is a standard symbol. Also, he's holding a rod, the wand of measure, and also for weight, a bag of to weigh things. Hermes, god of weights and measures. He was a trickster god, commerce, weights and measures, travelers and knowledge. It's all blended in. Navigation, weights and measures for commerce, navigation for commerce. It's just all connects in. This is your typical depiction of the Old Art of Perseus. Again, he's got the sword holding Medusa's head. It's backwards from this one because the stellarium view will give you from looking at the Earth into the heavens, as where many of these older constellation art is the God's eye view. So you're looking outside the Earth, projecting it down onto the Earth, which is an important thing in places like Washington, Canberra, Brasilia, Astana, which are essentially cities which are also a star chart and embedded with these things. Okay, so the story of Perseus, he was tricked into... Perseus was the son of Zeus, and he was half mortal, half god. Now,
Perseus was tricked in a quest to kill the Gorgon or Medusa. To aid him in his quest, Perseus received a number of gifts. The winged sandals of Hermes, Mercury. You can even, not the winged cap, but you can do the winged sandals. So he was able to fly with these. Now, the more modern stories, he wasn't able to fly until he got the winged horse Pegasus. But again, that's just a sort of modern twist on the old story. They've taken that out from the original. He also had the sword, adamantine sword, which was most descriptions was a curved sword, more like your old Egyptian swords. But that was one of his other gifts. Now he also got the helmet of Hades, god of the underworld, brother of Zeus, a sort of invisibility helmet. And he also received a shield, or the Aegis, from Athena. Now the shield, or the Aegis, is a bit, now usually, say for instance Athena with the owl, the goddess of wisdom, but also of defensive military arts, usually depicted with holding the shield. Now, in other statues, you'll also see her. Now, this is also so that shield is the Aegis, but the original sort of description is that the Aegis was a goat hide. Now, you'll also see again Medusa's head on there, just like the shield. Now, this will go back to okay. So just below Perseus, we have the constellation Auriga. He's holding Capra, or the goat. Now, this is connected to the Aegis or the shield, which goes back to Zeus once more, and the origin of the cornucopia. Zeus, god of the sky, the eagle and the thunderbolt being one of his symbols. Now, the eagle, thunderbolt, also known as Jupiter, was Zeus to the Romans. He was one of the children of Kronos or Saturn, just like Saturn. The father of Saturn, Uranus, was going to destroy his children. Saturn did the same thing. He overthrew his father. Then there was a prophecy that Saturn's children would overthrow him, so he ate them one by one, all of them except for Zeus. And Rhea and Kronos, was the Titans, were the parents of the Olympian gods. And Rhea tricked Saturn into vomiting back up the children he had eaten by feeding him a rock, because he thought that this stone was Zeus, the child Zeus, because Zeus was the only one who he hadn't eaten yet. This goes back to part 17, and the peacock and Ara, the altar upon which the Olympians swore their oath in the war against the Titans, Saturn, and Zeus, moons Io and Europa. I'll put the link part 17 because we'll go into it more there. But of the children who were swallowed, only Zeus was not. His mother hid him away, and he was nourished by the goat Amalthea. While playing with the goat, he accidentally broke off one of the horns. This led to one of the origins of the cornucopia, the horn of plenty. This was gifted to humanity. And just as he was nourished by the goat, so humanity would be nourished by the cornucopia. In appreciation of this, Amalthea was placed, the goat was placed in the constellation Auriga just below Perseus there, and also one of the moons of Jupiter, just like Io and Europa in these stories connected to Zeus. Now, the Aegis was made from the goat, from the hide of Amalthea, and it was like basically in an invincibility sort of shield. Again, depicted sometimes as his hide, and usually the Medusa there on the front, and sometimes as a shield. Athena also holds a cornucopia. I'll put the link to the cornucopia series in here, but back to Perseus and these gifts. He also received another gift. Zeus ordered Athena to send her owl of wisdom, Bode, to help Perseus. Instead, she had Hephaestus, the god of metalwork, or Vulcan, fire, make a mechanical replica rather than part with her owl. So this owl symbolism connected to Athena once again, goddess of wisdom, defensive arts. Now, using the shield, you can't look at Medusa; she would turn you into stone. Perseus used the shield to the reflection to see her. That way, he was able to overcome her, cut off her head, and when he decapitated her, the winged horse Pegasus, this constellation, sprung forth from her body. Now, Equus, this horse constellation there, we see there still in the modern art, and there we have the dolphin constellation Delphinus. Now, this is another one of these constellations which has lost its original meaning. So,
Delphinus is now depicted in your more original dolphin form. Well, not original, more, like Flipper. This was the original Delphinus, this more sort of grotesque looking thing. Here we see Poseidon with the water horses, Hippocampus, and his chariot at the front would be Delphinus. So we can see some of those dolphins there which match this thing. Now, Delphinus got its position in the heavens because Poseidon proposed to Amphitrite, but she refused his initial proposal, ran away and hid in the mountains. And then Delphinus found her and convinced her to come back to Poseidon. And in appreciation, Delphinus the dolphin was rewarded with their place in the stars. Now, this will connect to Poseidon or Neptune, because Equus, now Poseidon's the patron god of horse racing, and we see this horse connected there. So Poseidon, Neptune, the brother of Zeus, one of the Olympian gods. Which brings us back to this star chart and Cepheus and Cassiopeia, this constellation here. Now, Cepheus and Cassiopeia are the parents of Andromeda, and that connects to Perseus and to Neptune, because Cepheus claimed his wife Cassiopeia was more beautiful than the Nereids. This upset Poseidon / Neptune quite a bit, and he was offended, so he sent the sea monster Cepheus in punishment. So just like in the movie shows. Okay, so Cepheus claimed his wife Cassiopeia more beautiful than Nereids. That upset Poseidon, Neptune, no end, and so he sent Cetus, the sea monster, in punishment to attack the city. Now, to save themselves, they chained their daughter Andromeda to a rock as an offering to the sea monster. Now that brings us back to Perseus, because on his way home, Perseus come across this, and he saw Andromeda chained to a rock, and so he used the severed head of Medusa the Gorgon, and he turned the sea monster in the stone. So even in the movies, they still sort of stay true to that part of the story, at least. Now, and then Perseus and Andromeda were married, and they founded the Perseid dynasty of Mycenae, which was a civilization forerunner to classical Greek cultures. There were also a few other links worth mentioning. So Zeus, now his Aquila, the eagle constellation, which is also, so for instance, the four evangelists, also the four cardinal points, but the four evangelists have the angel, the bull, the lion, Leo the lion, Taurus the bull, Aquarius the angel, but also the eagle there, Aquila, which is standard Christian symbolism, but that Aquila also carries the lightning bolt of Zeus, which is that famous symbol. Now, just over the side here we have Hercules, or Heracles, the Greek name. He was the son of Zeus. Everyone's probably heard of Hercules. And we also have the constellation Lyra. Now that brings us back to Hermes. So the Hermes, there was almost war on Olympus because Hermes and Apollo were fighting over the cattle. It's a sort of interesting story, but Hermes made a lyre out of tortoiseshell, and he gave that to Apollo as an offering of peace. And Apollo liked it so much that he gave him a magic wand of an olive branch to Hermes. Hermes later found two snakes fighting. That's where you get the classical caduceus, but again, the wand, the measuring rod, but also the lyre. But there's also another story of Orpheus connected to the lyre, and that was thrown into the river, and Zeus ordered an eagle to salvage that lyre from the river. So that's another connection in there as well. So there's quite a bit of, okay, while I'm here, okay, now I'll leave that for another one, but yeah, Hermetic knowledge, the quadrivium, and how it doesn't just apply to astronomy, geometry, arithmetic, and music. Through weights and measure, things like navigation, these other aspects come to the fore, and so that's why. So there's a story. These stories also incorporate science knowledge and well, especially navigation, but okay, weights and measures so important, but you learn the story as a child, and then as you grow up and well, you become a navigator, for instance, because especially people in the Mediterranean, shipping was so essential to them, and you need to know the stars. Now, this is a universal thing, of course, and that's why certain constellations are just, even though their names might be different, stories might be different, but they're still really important globally. But yeah, so these classical stories contain quite a bit of information, interesting stuff. And yeah, there's more to this to come, but I'll put the link because, for instance, back in episode 17, I mentioned Pavo, which would be over here in the southern, so that's the south pole over here, and we have Pavo and Ara connected to there, but also the Phoenix, Constellation, and Fornax, which was the chemist laboratory, amongst these other things. Yeah, that link will be in the description. I'll also put a link in the description to the cornucopia because now Iridanius, I forget, sorry, the name of this constellation is off the tip of, can't remember, but it represents the river Tiber, that river which ran through Rome, and it also connects to the cornucopia as well. But yeah, I'll put the cornucopia series because that's joins with this, and part 17 from this series because yeah, the constellations and the information contained in them. Part 18 and 19 I talked about craft symbols, as in the Freemasonic craft, and you have another one there with triangulae, and also Musco used to be here, but okay, that's another thing. So with that, I hope you enjoyed, and we'll be getting more, returning back to the more alchemical aspects of it. But as a building block of Hermeticism, this is just really important, and it's something, unfortunately, which has been lost on the more I don't know, I don't, which was a better word, but the new agey stuff which goes out there, which, you know, sort of claims that as long as you take hallucinogenics, all this will appear to you. Well, no, it doesn't. It's about study and learning. You can't just get things, you know, anything that's too cheap is because it's not valuable in that way. And so, yeah, study, measure, and the truth shall set you free.